Good morning, wherever this finds you in this wonderful country of ours. Welcome to the latest edition of the Canadian Optimists panel discussion. We appreciate you joining us for another Canada Strong and Free Network event. As you probably know, I am Jamil Jivani, president of CSFN, and I'm really happy to kick things off today, where we're having a conversation that I know is important and very interesting to many people in the Canada Strong and Free Network, a conversation about newly elected leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, Pierre Poilievre. Before we get started and I introduce my co-hosts, I do want to just give a couple of announcements off the top. First, I want to say thank you to everyone who joined us in Red Deer on September 24th. It is our second biggest event of the year, and it lived up to the hype. Just the panelists, the discussions were fantastic. We had a great turnout of people from Alberta, also people coming in from other provinces. Anyone who participated, who helped us share the links on social media, who helped us spread the word about the event. Really appreciate all the love and support. We also, of course, thank our sponsors and everyone else who made the event possible. We will be back in Red Deer again next year, and we look forward to sharing information about those dates and the venue and all that as time goes by. But right now we're focused on the next event, and I'd like to give you a save the date. So those who are in Red Deer would know this, but I think this is the first time we're sharing this at the Canadian Optimists event. Our next conference in Ottawa will be on March 22nd, 23rd, and 24th next year, so roughly 5 months away. We've got a bunch of stuff that we're going to be announcing over the coming weeks and months about that. But I will say that we do have some people confirmed to be there, including BC Liberal Party leader Kevin Falcon and Iranian human rights activist Kaveh Shahrouz. There will be a bunch more politicians and business leaders and folks to be announced shortly, but we're going to hit the ground running, and I think it's going to be another fantastic event. So please do save the date. Again, March 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, if you have ideas about the conference, if you'd like to sponsor the conference, if you have any questions about the conference, feel free to email me directly. My email is jamil@canadastrongandfree.network. That's jamil@canadastrongandfree.network. All right, without further ado, I'm happy to welcome our co-hosts, Chris Spoke and Matt Spoke, the Canadian Optimists.
Yeah, thank you. So my name's Chris Spoke. Matt will introduce himself shortly, but very briefly, I operate a digital product studio here in Toronto called August. But this series, the Canadian Optimist series, and this is our third episode, I guess, of the series, is intended to identify and interview Canadian optimists inside or outside of government, specifically to promote their optimism and inspire others to adopt it for themselves. So some of you, I'm sure, have joined us in our last two events, but for those who haven't, I'm gonna add a little bit of color to that. So we define optimists as people who think that the future can be better than the present, but who also know that they will need to work hard to make it so. So this is in contrast to a brand of extreme optimism that is counterintuitively similar to extreme pessimism in one important way. Both extreme optimists and pessimists think that there's nothing to be done, right? The optimists think that we've kind of achieved everything that we want to achieve, and there's no hard work left. And the extreme pessimists think that all our problems are insurmountable. And in either case, they both kind of land on this shared solution of sitting on their hands and doing nothing. So we take a different view, which is, again, this definite optimism that both has this positive outlook toward the future, but also recognizes that the future doesn't simply unfold according to its own designs, but it has to be actively built by people, by us. So Matt will introduce our guests in a moment, but I'll just say at the outset that we believe them to both be true Canadian optimists and would like to explore in particular, and I think this is why a lot of people have joined us as well, the recent involvement with Pierre Poilievre's leadership campaign. So I've seen following the election and his election as leader, there has been some commentary that's taken the tone of like, oh, we didn't realize the Conservative Party base was this angry or this crazy, and that kind of explains, his brilliant strategy in captivating or optimizing on that, which is not my takeaway from the election. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more of this from our guests. Rather, I get the sense that we've had insufficient optimism, that we haven't had many reasons to be optimistic, and that a lot of people see this new leader as maybe providing some of that reason. So we again think that this is very much on brand with what we're trying to highlight and what we're trying to do with the series, and look forward to getting into that. So I'll hand it over to Matt.
Thanks, Chris. And as Chris said, I think these two guests probably can speak to this topic better than almost anybody in the country. So I'm really excited to welcome Ginny Roth and Michael Wilson. Ginny, based in Toronto, is the National Practice Lead for Government Relations at Crestview Strategies. She's been a longtime conservative activist, and she served as the Director of Communications for Pierre Poilievre's successful leadership campaign. She's also a regular contributor to the National Post and the Hub, and you'll also see her regularly at Canada Strong and Free events. So Ginny's definitely no new personality for people who participate in these events regularly. Michael Wilson is a litigation partner at Goodmans LLP, one of Canada's largest and most active law firms. Previous to his role at Goodmans, Michael was the Chief of Staff to the Attorney General of Ontario. And during Pierre Poilievre's leadership campaign, he served as a senior advisor focused on national field organization, and is continuing to assist the leader and the party in preparation for the upcoming general election, whenever that may be. So Michael, Ginny, thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to have you on the panel.
Thanks, Matt.
I might kick us off. I think you both, obviously from your introductions, you've both been involved in the Poilievre story for, call it, the last 6 months or so. And I'm sure that even dates back further to before the election process started for a new leader. I'd be really curious to just get your sort of firsthand perspective on why you joined the campaign, what excited you about Pierre, why you think we should be excited about him, not only as a leader for the Conservative Party, but as a prospective future prime minister. And maybe you can talk, as much about his policies as him, the person, and sort of who he is behind the scenes, something we might not see every day as sort of observers on the outside.
Maybe I'll go first and break the ice.
Okay.
I actually didn't know Pierre Poilievre before the leadership. I met him for the first time over the phone as he was assembling a team. But I obviously had observed him, and I follow conservative politics closely. And in observing what happened after the last election, and frankly in the last two general election campaigns since the Conservatives formed government, it just felt like the reason I'm a conservative is because I think conservative solutions are the best way to address the problems that ail the nation, to unlock the kind of public policy solutions that will make things better. And we kind of ran two general election campaigns, particularly the last one, not really on that. We didn't really make a strong argument for why conservative solutions are what Canadians need, and why they should elect our party and people who run for our party. And I wrote a column for the National Post after Aaron O'Toole was removed as leader, saying, not only do you have to make the argument and have policies that make the argument, you actually need to kind of fight for it. Because our opponents fight for it, and they fight for their arguments with passion and in a way that kind of doesn't accept the premise of the other side. And that we had spent the last number of years accepting the premise of the other side and just sort of accepting a baseline view of the world and the country that progressive solutions are the only option. So we were always on the back foot, we were always on the defense. We were always defending conservative policies and conservative solutions instead of presenting them in their best possible light and explaining why they're better. And I was drawn to Poilievre's leadership campaign, and I sort of put my hand up and said, I want to help, because I just saw him as that fighter. And I think it's an interesting, we'll talk more about this, but I think optimists have to be fighters. You can't be a passive optimist, I guess is the way I would put it. And I think he is an optimist. And if you speak to people who have been inspired to attend his events, join his campaign, sign up, donate money, whatever, it's not because they're scared and he's channeling their fear or because they're angry. It may be because they're angry and he's passionately trying to understand where their anger is coming from. But it's because the follow-up to that is and here's what I'm going to do about it. And I'm not going to be shy about that. And so I think he is unique among leaders in a lot of ways in having that personality and those sets of expectations for himself. And that's certainly why I got involved.
Sure. So it's actually the same for me in terms of, I don't think I'd ever spoken to Pierre Poilievre before he announced he was running for leader. But I maybe met him in passing at an event, but I can't actually even recall that, to be honest. He is somebody obviously that I knew of and was aware of his sort of where he stood in politics, but was not somebody I had a pre-existing relationship with at all. And it was exactly what Ginny says about the fact that he was willing to articulate a positive conservative vision for the future of the country, as opposed to trying to win. He clearly isn't going to try to win the next election by being as close to Justin Trudeau as possible without any indistinguishable difference, and hoping that people are just upset with him. He's going to offer, as we saw through leadership, his own ideas, his own narrative for how to make the country a better place and what needs to change. And I was tired at both the federal and the provincial level of conservative governments that just want to act like liberal governments, or conservative parties that just want to act like liberal parties. And I'm optimistic, to steal the name of the show, that we have elected a leader that's going to stand up and offer Canadians an actual choice in the next election. And there were certainly outcomes that wouldn't have allowed for that in the leadership race. And I thought as well, after a backdrop of 2 years of COVID policy, which I almost entirely disagreed with, that it was time to actually get more engaged than I had been in a long time in active party politics.
Yeah, that makes sense. I really like the point you made, Jen, that being an optimist is not being a passive optimist. Like this is kind of like the point I was trying to make, where you have to be an active participant in whatever the solution, to whatever the problem set is. And we certainly get that from Pierre. One point I've made as an outsider, kind of looking at the campaign through like either social media or speeches or the videos that were being put out, is he comes across as a leader who his words originate in his own brain, which sounds like a kind of like a silly thing to say, but that wasn't the case, or that's not the case with a lot of politicians. Without kind of singling anybody out, it often feels there's a vibe of like an orchestrated, focus grouped, carefully crafted message, as opposed to somebody having, let's say, the courage of his convictions and just communicating those clearly. So maybe Ginny, starting with you, and then Michael, could you speak a little bit about that? I hesitate to use the word authenticity because I don't think it's specific enough, but it's really the fact that he does seem to have, actually a friend of ours, Alicon, made the point that he has the attitude of a staffer, like where he actually knows the issues, but he's not a politician. He's like a staffer. So yeah, maybe you could kind of riff on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I had a really practical experience supporting the candidate on the communications, right? Like the communications products and what he's going to say, both in writing and verbally. And it was a real shock as someone who has been involved in politics over the last decade or so, where you really seen a move towards, it's not just like not saying anything of substance, it's actually actively trying to avoid saying things. Like if you read a government news release these days from a government of any stripe, like it basically says nothing. Like it's a series of sentences that avoid trying to take a stance. And that is the core of issues management when you learn it as a political staffer. It's like, how do I get out of committing to something or saying something? And working with Pierre was the opposite, right? Like he would not utter or put out in writing a phrase or a word or a sentence that didn't say something. And that it makes for really strong communications because people connect with it. People immediately understand what you're saying and they either agree or disagree. And if they agree, they're inspired. They're way more likely to be inspired by it and get behind a movement and put showing up and money and all of that behind getting involved. And it also speaks to substance. Like you also can't just do that style. You have to actually also, to your point about Ali Khan, like you have to actually know the issues, because you have to be really solid and know that if I say this, I'm going to be able to stand by it later. If I say this, I'm going to have to know what it entails and like what the policy ramifications are. And so you have to be like incredibly well read and researched. You have to have like the strategic mind to think forward and think about what that means. And so it was a real shift and I don't even think it's a partisan or an ideological thing. I think it's a style of how to do politics. And it clearly appeals to people. Like I also, part of why I like him is I really reject this premise in politics that you have to choose between like good policy and good comms, and that the two things are always in opposition. It actually is, really good policy should be able to be communicated well. And if you can't communicate it well, maybe you should ask yourself if the policy's that great, And if you're communicating something really well and you can't back it up with policy and execute it, then you shouldn't be saying it. And it sounds like naive almost to say that, but I think it's actually what people crave. And in this whole piece of authenticity, it's part of why he's so popular.
Yeah, I was gonna add. Sorry, Michael. I'll let you jump in a second. But I think like one of the biggest things that jumps out to me is this idea that in the process of electing a leader and eventually a prime minister, we sort of lose sight of the fact that we want somebody to lead us on public opinion, not just respond to public opinion. Like, I think this idea that you should sort of like poll the country to understand what they think the right solutions are to the problems that are in front of us completely diminishes the role of having leadership, the role of having somebody who actually, informs our views on what solutions could be and what direction we might take. Because it seems like a lot of our politicians to date, they just sort of, no fault to the public. The public only knows to respond to things they've heard of before. So if you have an idea that they haven't heard before, it's not going to show up in a poll, right? So you can't build a policy around a poll on an idea that's unheard of, right? So Pierre Poilievre, let's say, for example, going and really tackling the housing issue, which I know we'll get to later. It's probably nothing that ever would have shown up in a poll for what a federal leader should have been talking about, because that's not where people usually think about, this policy topic, for example. So, I mean, what's exciting to me is just seeing actual leadership to lead public opinion, not just respond to public opinion. But anyways, Michael, I'll let you jump in on this question before we move on.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's just 2 points. One, Chris, like it's authenticity, it's consistency, right? Like if you're a politician that says whatever some 22-year-old staffer put in your hand from a briefing note or talking points, and you say them, Pierre's the kind of guy that's saying the same things he's been saying for 20 years, so he knows what he wants to say. That's the benefit of having, there's upsides and downsides to long track records in politics. His is he knows what he believes and he knows what he wants to say. He's particularly good at knowing how to say it, and particularly good at like communicating issues. I remember, Ginny, I don't know if you recall, we could have a whole session on reading mean tweets. There was somebody that tweeted at one of Pierre's videos that said, this guy's I don't know if we can swear on this podcast. I'll just say this guy's a jerk. But boy, whoever makes his videos is amazing. Yeah. And Ginny says, boy, do I have news for this person. Like, the guy that makes his videos is him. Like you're right. It all does originate in his mind. Has a team around him that helps him execute, but like he is the guy that comes up with what he wants to say and drives the bus for sure, 100%.
And I think those things actually tie together, right? Because if you're able to communicate directly to your constituency or to the public at large, you're able, I think, to speak a little bit more freely or be a little bit less guarded, because the risk is if you rely on intermediaries, on a medium like the media, you might say 10 things and then they'll pick up 2 of them, like maybe something about the convoy and something about Bitcoin, and that will become like a defining frame. But that's a lot less effective when you also have, let's say, his videos outperforming in terms of engagement and views and everything else, anything else. So he's able to restate clearly what his actual position is and not allow himself to be pigeonholed. So I think like the man is right for the moment in terms of like what the public wants to see, but also the technology is right for the moment. Like it actually kind of enables that. Ginny, again, back to you as having been the director of communications in the campaign. Maybe could you tell us a little bit about this? What the thought process was in terms of trying to not allow for him to be pigeonholed in these ways that I think in many outlets he was pigeonholed. I'll just briefly mention you were on an episode of The Agenda with Andrew Coyne, where Andrew Coyne made the point, he's like, there is no Poilievrism, right? All he talks about is convoys and crypto, and it's more a tone and a disposition, an angry disposition, but there's no coherent ideology, which is, again, very, very much not what I saw in the campaign. So can you tell us a little bit about like how do you manage that so that he's setting his own frame throughout the campaign?
Yeah, I think Pierre has observed what many of us have observed, which is that the mainstream media, for lack of a better descriptor, has one, they're just less popular. Like they cannot in a market environment attract enough readers and viewers to subsidize and grow their businesses and like turn a profit. So that tells you something. Like they're out of touch with Canadians in a lot of ways. And that 2, a lot of the ways that they've drifted out of touch are not favorable to conservatives, right? There's like a baseline bias, I think, inherent to most owners of, producers on, reporters, journalists, people involved in the mainstream media that takes as a baseline assumption a lot of liberal assumptions about how the world works or progressive assumptions about how the world works that don't lend themselves to understanding where Pierre Poilievre is coming from and also like what Canadians want in a lot of cases. And so rather than just accepting that the mainstream media was the only filter through which he could deliver a message, he learned, I think, through social media and using social media and experimenting with it over the years. And this he's been doing this for years, as many politicians who are involved in social media have been, how to get a message across and build an audience organically online so that you don't need those filters, right? Like he didn't invent this, like lots of people really successfully use social media to bypass the mainstream media filter. And that was one of the biggest ways he got his message across. It was like in person at big events, through social media, online and through social media channels. And then also to a lesser extent through like non-traditional, non-mainstream media, where there's still a filter, but the filter is less likely to take as a baseline assumption a liberal worldview that would question a lot of where he comes from. It's interesting because where he did engage with the mainstream media, he did a Shannon Proudfoot interview with Maclean's early on. He did a lot of Quebec local media because I think the Quebec media is frankly more popular with its own people than our English media is. He performs really well, right? Like it's not like the guy's scared of the questions, and because he often is willing to push back on the premise of a question, he can kind of push back against the framing that can be negative for a lot of conservatives. But why would you do that if the only audience you're accessing is a narrow, increasingly diminishing audience because the mainstream media is failing at their jobs, when you can actually access way more people through your own channels and deliver the message you want to deliver? So, I mean, to Mike's point, this is really him. Like this is his approach to politics, and our team's job was to facilitate that, and I think we did. And I think it showed that while there are some exceptions, I think local broadcast is important. A lot of people still tune into their local evening news in regional parts of the country. That like traditional mainstream Ottawa-based political show that very few people watch is not a gate you have to pass through to get your message across.
Yeah, totally. I think another thing that kind of gives us confidence, going back to this idea that we believe that he believes what he's saying, is I think there's a lot of hesitation, especially I think in conservative politics, where people get excited about a leader because they're saying the right thing during a leadership race, and then there's this big pivot during the general election. Of course, we saw this very clearly with the last leader, Erin O'Toole. And then there's typically a further pivot once they get elected, and then kind of all these bold promises and bold action that they've kind of floated throughout the campaign takes a backseat to maybe the realities of governing, which often includes like an actively oppositional bureaucracy that doesn't want to implement the things that you say you want to implement. And I think that fear and risk is somewhat mitigated again by us believing to some extent that there is a real conviction here. But beyond that, what can you tell us just knowing the candidate? And we'll start with you, Michael. Is this something that people should be concerned about? Is this something that you're concerned about? That like, okay, we're hearing the right things now, but are we actually going to see more than like incrementalism 2.0 when we form government?
So I share the concern. I have no special telepathic skill to be able to hope to be able to predict that won't happen, but I believe it won't happen. Like you, I believe it won't happen. I think, again, it goes back to the consistency. So I spent a lot of time on the road during the campaign at different events, and there was an event very early on. It was very cold, so I think it was late March in Kitchener, and he got asked by a reporter, why should people, the last leader had a bit of a track record of saying one thing during the leadership and something else after. Why should people believe you're going to say what you're going to, like, you're going to do what you're saying, or why that you actually believe what you're saying, those kind of questions. And Pierre referred to an article or I don't know whether it was the Adams Prime Minister essay he wrote or some essay he wrote 20 years ago. He said, if you go look at this essay I wrote 20 years ago, I'm saying the same things I said then. The things I said then are the same things I'm saying now. I thought it was a great answer, and I thought nothing more of it. And then one of the last events we went to was in Nanaimo. It was our third last big event of the leadership race in either very late August or very early September. And a woman came to the event with like a book. with all these essays. I think it was from the As Prime Minister contest, and she had his essay in this book. She said, "I saw your question. I went and I found this copy of your essay," and she got him to sign it. It actually does say the same things you're saying now, or the things you wrote in this essay 20 years ago. So the sort of only kernel of the only thing you could rely on is like long-standing consistency, and at least that we have. Whereas when you see people that say one thing and then do another, typically it's not the first time they've said one thing and done another, or they have a very short record of showing up in a leadership race that seems a bit inconsistent with what they stood for before. So we have long-standing consistency, and that's why I have to hope that he'll at least try to do what he's saying. And you're right, you get into government and maybe you're in a minority, or maybe the bureaucracy's against you, or there's other things happen that you just don't predict that you have to deal with, global recessions, inflation, whatever, but that give you some headwinds in implementing your agenda. But I think he's going to at least try to implement the things he talks about.
Yeah, I mean, if you're an ideologue, if I just build on that, like if you're an ideologue, and you have a vision, but you want to be in politics, you still have to live within the guardrails of politics. And everyone's guardrails are different. Like if you blow with the wind and your guardrail is like what a poll said yesterday, then you aren't really much of an ideologue. you don't really stand for much, and you don't have much of a vision. But you can't argue with the makeup of parliament, and our system of government, and some baseline realities about how politics works. You have to build a movement, and you have to build a movement that's viable, because you cannot, without that political capital and support, continue to win government and then continue to govern. And so I also would be interested in supporting a leadership candidate who was so ideological as to have zero political instinct or zero ability to make decisions about what to emphasize based on needing to form a winning coalition, And so I really reject the premise that that's one is one, you stack up issues on one side and the other side, and it's an inherent trade-off. If for every good policy you want to do, you lose support in politics. I think it's actually often the opposite. But you may run up against political challenges. And part of why I like Pierre Poilievre is I think it was a William F. Buckley quote that as conservatives, you should support the most conservative person who can also win. And that's kind of always been my approach to politics, right? It's he's the most conservative candidate who can win because he wants to win. He has that objective, and he's not going to shoot himself in the foot for the sake of, emphasizing something that people don't care about right now or something like that. And so I think that's also important.
Maybe quick pivot to
Sorry, Matt.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Before we pivot, I'm just curious if I could just ask a follow-up to Ginny, and Michael, feel free to weigh in on this too, which is how do you determine what can win? I think it's a really important question because in my view, one of the data points would be enthusiasm, people showing up to your events, your rallies, garnering thousands of supporters. That was not really taken throughout the leadership campaign as evidence of the Poilievre campaign having a broader appeal beyond sort of the conservative base, but I would argue that it is evidence of that. And yet when people sort of talk about what can win and who can win, often it's just based on assumptions of what people actually want the politicians to be doing. So what can win is usually whatever you want the politician to say. I'm curious, how you guys have thought about what is a winnable, set of policies or messages, and how you think people should think about that, broadly speaking.
Mike, do you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that this sort of goes back to the very first question, which is he actually offers a choice and a distinction. So I don't think we can win by simply trying to be as indistinguishable as possible from our opponents, who will then be more authentic on whatever message they're talking about. So the fact that he is willing to offer a distinct, as we said, to articulate and defend a positive conservative message and vision for what he wants to do. And so a track record of having been able to do that in opposition leads me to think that he could do it as an opposition critic or member, leads me to think that if he's the leader of the party, he can do that consistently as leader. He'll offer Canadians a choice. And once we're at least offering Canadians a choice that's actually a real distinction, then you have a chance of winning.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of in my comment to bait you, Jamil. I knew you'd respond to what I was saying. I think you're right. Salience and engagement is a really key piece of it, and the confidence to try to make a winning argument. Like I often use the example of guns or crime, right? So the last couple elections, if you're a conservative, you assume guns are a losing issue. If we're talking about guns in a national election campaign a few weeks out from an election, that's probably not good for conservatives. Not because we don't have a coherent policy on guns. In fact, I would argue a better policy on guns. Of course we do. But because, you know, you need to win enough votes across the country in enough important parts of the country. And if the liberals have gotten really good about freaking people out, that, you know, if the conservatives are in power, there'd be more guns on the streets or whatever. Now, it's easy for them to make that argument when we're not making a counter argument or talking about the issue set. Today, if you're a conservative and you make an argument about crime and how experimental progressive policies have completely failed people on crime, they've lowered our quality of life, they've made neighborhoods more unsafe, crime has gone up under the Trudeau Liberals. Oh, and by the way, your dumb gun policy, criminals don't listen to it. They don't follow the rules. That's the whole reason why they're criminals. Like all of a sudden it's a winning argument and a winning issue set, right? And so, I don't know if this is what you were getting at, Jamil, but I think if you can look at what's salient and then make a really strong, compelling argument for why, you can change the framing of the debate and turn a not winning issue into a winning issue. If you've got an issue set where it's not that salient and it is hard to make an argument based on like the economic climate or whatever, then maybe you de-emphasize it because it's not a winning issue and you want to be talking about your winning issues. But we have given up on way too many issues, right? Climate and energy policy is another great example. It's like better to not talk about developing onto Canada's oil sands because then we look like we're against climate. Well, we just ceded a massive bunch of ground to the left on that, and we did that for the last 10 years, I would argue. You know, Poilievre coming out and saying, whoa, we buy oil, we just buy Saudi oil. Meanwhile, we have it in the ground in Canada. It's absurd, right? He's just like, he's taking that ground back and making the argument on it and turning it into a winning issue.
I would just to follow up on that point, I was listening to Jenny Byrne on the Curse of Politics podcast last week. And one of the things that sort of come up regularly, and I think Pierre's definitely leading sort of a re-emphasis on an issue that's been ignored by the Liberals and the NDP, is this idea of just like pocketbook economic issues, understanding, you know, where people are in their lives economically, almost speaking to like class politics as opposed to identity politics. It seems like it's been a winning issue to date. He's the only one talking about, you know, cost of living. He was the only one talking about inflation 3-4 months ago. He was the only one talking about housing prices. I'm curious as to like how defensible that is, because, you know, say you roll back 6 months and you wouldn't have heard the NDP or the Liberals admitting to these problems, but now they're sort of cluing in that it's resonating. And so they're going to have different, you know, policy prescriptions to how to resolve that. I think of like, you know, Pierre coming out with his just inflation narrative. And now you've got the NDP coming out with their greedflation narrative, where they're blaming it all on grocery store CEOs or whatever it might be. You know, is that a defensible strategy going into a general or even over the course of the next few years? Or is the tone shifting enough that the Liberals and NDP are also going to be talking about those sort of pocketbook economic issues more than they might have a year or two ago, given the climate we're in?
I mean, the struggle the Liberals will have is, so first of all, what we'll be talking about in 3 years,
who knows?
Who knows, right? But like the struggle the Liberals will have is they carry the baggage of being responsible for the actual outcomes. So the reason they don't want to talk about pocketbook issues, or when they come up, they pivot sort of to unusual topics, is because they can't defend the situation they've got the country into. So, I mean, the NDP has, you've noticed the costly coalition messaging, like that they should wear some of that as well. They have at least have some daylight between them and the actual outcomes. But I mean, the government, it can say whatever it wants to say, but unless it actually acts with policies that make a difference, then there's not much they can do.
Yeah, I hate to keep coming back to the like defensive, offensive, like war metaphors, or sports metaphors or whatever. It's very masculine of me, but so let's look at climate over the last 10 years as an example, right? The Liberals took over, like they took the whole field on climate. So like we've been conservatives, if we've been fighting on climate, have been fighting in their end. And I mean, Aaron O'Toole's platform commitment on climate which was like totally incomprehensible and had something to do with like, I don't know, buying e-bikes with some kind of carbon credit or something, like was such a losing like policy proposition. And we were so deep in and like they were dunking on us every day on climate, right? On pocketbook issues, like let's just take inflation as an example. Pierre has spent the last 3 years, like long before anyone was talking about inflation in Canada, laying the groundwork and like inching his way down the field and owned it to the point where now he owns that issue so firmly. The Conservatives owe it so firmly. We're so deep in our end, whatever the extension of the metaphor is, that anytime they talk about it, like they're actually just, I think, increasing his positives on inflation because they're playing catch up. They're talking about the issue they created. They're reminding people that they were part of the crowd that was calling it transitory and dismissing people's like really painful experiences of not being able to afford groceries and gas like all summer long. And I just think he has so much credibility on it, and he owns the issue so strongly that that his caucus, like anytime we're talking about inflation, even if the NDP and the Liberals twist themselves into pretzels trying to adjust for it, then so that's like the political strategy of it. Ideologically, I also think conservative solutions are called for in an inflationary environment. So there's some opportunity there that it's not just, I don't want to say it's just luck, but the economic circumstances are such that it's kind of bearing out his whole theory about how we should think about our Canada's economy and what that means for people's like day-to-day experience and what they can afford.
So I was just going to say, like, this is the issue. The Liberal government's not going to do what it needs to do to make things better because they're not going to implement conservative fiscal policies.
Well, nor admit that they made a mistake in the first place, right?
Or and like again, like there's the clips of Pierre. Not only do they call it transitory, they said, "What we're worried about deflation, not inflation." Like we're just out of much, right? And they're not gonna fix the problem. Not to say the problem won't fix itself over 3 years. Like who knows where we'll be in 2025 if that's how long we are to the election. But these guys in the government aren't gonna fix it.
It's also not to say that is enough, right? Like I can picture an alternative universe where we have a conservative leader who's like a stuffy old guy who's, what we need is deficit hawkishness, and we just need to look at the budget and tighten our belts, and and making some sort of like 1980s argument that wouldn't resonate with people who, like the people who have been showing up at Pierre's rallies and saying like, I'm putting water in my milk because I can't feed my kids. He is meeting that anger and frustration with a message that speaks to their personal experience, and that is where his like political savvy and way of translating high-minded public policy into people's like real lived experience is much more politically successful than I think we've been in recent history.
Your impersonation of a happy old conservative guy is excellent.
Bang on. We've all heard it before for sure. There's a question from the audience that I think kind of attacks on nicely here. So I'm just going to read it verbatim. It's from John Robson. So he asked, I tuned in to hear an argument that Poilievre actually is conservative, but so far I've essentially heard the usual, to be blunt, about messaging. What about principle? Is there any single government program he would abolish? Would he cut taxes, double defense spending, protect the traditional family? I'm not voting for him because just inflation, in quotes, is a cute jibe. And what I would like to add to that question, and this again is for you, Ginny, but also for you, Michael, how do you think about messaging around like specific policies? My general sense, especially on this side of the aisle, is we should probably say less and do more. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I guess one, if we could answer the question directly about like what are his bona fides, and then two, is this the right time to like talk about these policies more explicitly, or is it not, and why?
I mean, I think you show up to any Poilievre event. Granted, they're fewer and further between now because we're not in a campaign, but I'm sure he'll be back on the road soon enough. The number of sentences that start with a Poilievre government will and then a statement of action, there's not just one or two of them, there's lots of them. So, a Poilievre government will introduce a pay-as-you-go act. Every dollar the government spends, they have to find a dollar in savings, like no new spending. So I'm not going to run through the raft of policy announcements, but there were a lot of them. He talked about them everywhere he went, and he was consistent with them throughout the whole campaign, and I think before and since. The the time to talk about policy, I think, is always, I mean, it's too early to roll out a platform, I would think. If I was asked, would you announce a platform for an election you don't know when it's going to occur on October 19th, 2022? I would say no, seems like a bad idea, because you don't know what the issues are going to be. You're the leader of the opposition. You have to hold the government to account on the issues of the day, while also offering an alternative. And I think he's laid out things he would do as prime minister in terms of a comprehensive platform up and down the raft of federal government responsibilities. That's something that should come closer to or during an election campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I don't like to get into like rhyming off all his policies, because then I'm like held accountable for forgetting the 17th of 17 things he would do on things he'd cut or whatever. But like, I mean, the infrastructure bank, the CBC, media subsidies, like that's billions right there, right? That we spend today that he wouldn't spend.
Energy policy would be another big one, right? Just getting pipelines built and developing.
Faster approvals for infrastructure and energy projects. His housing policy, which Chris is very familiar with, is like the amount of detail in that policy and the backgrounder is really quite significant. And there was some mention in the question about his support for growing families. I mean, I think one of the biggest reasons people say for why they put off having kids or don't have kids yet is because they can't afford a home. So, I do think it's important to take those issues in turn, mainly because that description of Pierre Poilievre as someone who's like all talk and no action is like, I just think the evidence from the campaign is so contrary to that. And I think it speaks to this narrative that sort of lazy narrative that a lot of the mainstream media has, and how they want to describe him because of how they view the world. And I think it's important to counter that and to not really accept the premise.
Yeah, I think it was certainly spin from opponents in the leadership campaign that he didn't have a platform. I mean, we didn't have a glossy document that was spiral bound that said like Pierre Poilievre platform. But if you went and listened to him speak, or you followed his videos or his Twitter, he announced substantive policy positions, lots of them. So I always thought it was a ridiculous question.
I was just hoping I was gonna, I'm just being conscious of time, and I think one thing that you could definitely do with Poilievre is dive deep into policy, deep into economics. I do wonder if we can spend some time talking about like, who is this guy and why is his story compelling, and is that something that we should care more about leading up to an election? Because I think, even the story you told about like that essay he wrote 20 years ago in the Becoming a Prime Minister essay series, to me sort of frames the guy as a political geek, right? But there's something more there that we started seeing sort of at the tail end of the leadership campaign that I don't think a lot of us have seen of Pierre. I'm happy to take this conversation wherever you want to take it, but I'm really curious to know more about Pierre, the personal story, and whether that's going to show up in messaging, because I think if Justin Trudeau did something well in 2015, as he framed himself as a person, people believed that this guy stood for something that was positive. There was sunny ways, and there was all these reasons to be excited about the character of this man. I think all of which has been disproven. But I think there is a compelling story behind Pierre that we just haven't been told yet. Is that something that was discussed during the leadership campaign? Is that something that you envision sort of showing up more now that the leadership is over? And what are the sort of highlights of that story that are worthwhile for people to know about?
Yeah, I don't think it's revealing too much to say that because of his wonkish personality, it doesn't always occur to him as a first instinct to like lead with his personal story.
Yeah.
Because he's a wonky guy. I think his thinking is like, well, it's not about me. It's about like people who I'm asking to support me and what I have to offer them, which is like policies that will make their lives better. So I want to talk about that. But I also think in his time in politics, he has sort of matured to the point of realizing that actually people are interested in his story and his like life and the people around him, and that is an asset for him. So you saw his wife Anna introduce him after the results were announced when he won the leadership, and I think that was the first time people saw her. She actually did appear at a lot of events that Mike was at, where she, especially in Quebec, where Spanish is her first language, French her second language, where she introduced him in Quebec, having lived a lot of her life in Montreal, and putting that forward. And then his two kids, they have two young kids, as well as his upbringing in Calgary, that he put in a video, which some people may remember, where he walks the streets of his hometown and by the house he grew up in. And he did that as a way of like an evocative visual way of talking about his message, which was that people who live those kind of modest lives should be able to succeed and do better for, in a generational way in Canada. And it's helpful that that's quite a contrast to our current prime minister. And so I think you're right. I think there's a lot to tell about his personal story, but I think you'll always hear it from him in the context of connecting with people on what they want out of a politician, which is an aspiration, a really optimistic aspiration to go back to our theme towards what Canada can and should be, and how his background kind of has informed his view of that.
Yeah, I think also the nature of a leadership campaign, it's lower budget. Like it's sort of like you're on you're in a car, you're on a plane, you're not traveling with your family. Anna was on the road a lot. She would introduce them, and people who love her, like she's a rock star in her own right. So she was able to really knock it out of the park on a lot of events across the country, and then show the whole country on the night of the leadership announcement. But I think in a general election too, the family usually is more prominent because they are, they can go on the road with the leader because it's a more robust operation. So I'm sure just by virtue of the mechanics of a national campaign, there'll be more of them in those 36 days. And probably in the lead up too, but there was some. But I think the video was where I come from. It was the title of the YouTube video, and talking about his life in Shaughnessy Boulevard or whatever it's called in Calgary. So there's some, but I think there'll be more for sure. Just because now that he is the leader of a political party, people will be more interested in who he is. Yeah,
he also talks about growing up in an economic environment in the early '80s. That was tough for his family and his parents. Like they had to make some of the tough choices that people are making today. It's sort of poetic, I guess, that it was Trudeau Sr. that created a lot of the conditions for that economic unrest. And so I think that can also help tell a story about why was he talking about inflation 2 years before everyone else was, right? It's because his ideology doesn't just come from like reading Hayek or something. It comes from lived experience that then got him into bookishness in university and reading theorists that kind of informed where he comes from. But it starts with a personal experience as it does for everyone. And being able to tell that part of the story, I think, will make people connect even better with where he's coming from.
So one thing that I found very interesting about him specifically and about this campaign was that he kind of strayed beyond traditional policy domains, and he talked a little bit more about the state capacity question. And Ginny, this is like one of my favorite topics, but let me make this a little bit more concrete with an example. So state capacity, for those in the audience, is basically the government's ability to actually do what it says it's going to do. So in 2020, the Liberal government set an immigration target of 340,000 immigrants. We wanted to kind of have this supply side response following the pandemic to get the economy buzzing. And one big piece of that was to let a lot more people in to contribute their productive energies and so forth. Only 185,000 visas were processed against that 340,000 person target because there's this massive backlog within the public service. So there's an inability within the public service to actually execute on these promises. And there's a piece that was published in the Globe and Mail last week saying that a lot of people who are in queue are basically giving up on Canada, and they're going to like Australia, New Zealand, and the US because we can't just get through the paperwork in anything resembling a timely manner. And as far as I can tell, and I've been following this stuff, for a little while, we typically, again, we stick to the policy domains that we're comfortable with, right? What are we going to do about taxes? What are we going to do about spending, the deficit? What are we going to do about healthcare and that sort of stuff? But going into the actual weeds of how policy pronouncements or promises turn into actual real world action isn't addressed. And I saw him address that. So one, am I right in having recognized this as a deliberate focus? And if so, because I think I am right, what do you think that tells us about something like, I don't know if like post ideological is the right term, but this is getting into things that, there's no ideological commitment to inefficiency. So we're getting kind of like beyond conservative versus progressive. We're just getting into like, can you get things done? And how do you think that frames an upcoming general election?
Yeah, I like, on the one hand, it can be ideological, right? Like, why aren't why aren't infrastructure and energy projects in Canada getting built? Well, a lot of it is capacity. Like a lot of it is just basic good management, like setting deadlines, managing a public service and a team of people to set fast, hit deadlines faster and that kind of thing. But like often those roadblocks are set up, whether it's declared or not, for ideological reasons, right? So sometimes it's declared. It's like, we've got to consult, and sometimes it's undeclared. Like a lot of the foot drag in government is because of undeclared ideology or opposition and that requires a style of leadership to break through that is underpinned by an ideology that expects to get those things done, and then also a personality and a style of leadership that won't settle for anything less than getting it done. And so it's both. Like I think it's the ideology has to be there and the vision has to be there for what you want to do and why. And then you have to also have the leadership style to like hire, like once you're in government, hiring and managing a political and public service staff is massively important to getting things done. And then like busting through some of the bureaucratic barriers that exist and enforcing it is like, there's a style piece there, there's a personality piece there. I think part of Pierre's appeal is that people think he will have that style.
Your question really makes it hard to be an optimist. It's yeah, I think that's right. Like it realistically, like government, especially at the federal level, is a giant bureaucracy, and it's like some of this is like they're opposed to what you want to do, and some of it's just it's a big ship to try to turn around, and then there's like on the actual like service delivery front, like the passport office, things like that just don't seem to work, and some of it's because people just aren't back at work yet, 2.5 years into COVID. But I think, the optimist in me is, again, that Pierre doesn't seem like the kind of guy that's going to settle for things not getting done.
Yeah, not to be a Mike Wilson ass kisser, but like Mike was part of a government that was slow on a lot of things, and so a lot of files that Mike held, Mike was known for like getting things done, and I only bring that up because Pierre should hire people like Mike if he forms government, right? And just knowing that, like just knowing I'm going to hire people who are on board with my vision. It starts with appointing cabinet, right? Like you hire senior staff and you appoint a cabinet of people who are on board with my vision and who understand my urgency, who channel my sense of urgency, and who I think will like fight internally to get things done and like stand up to, deputy ministers and public servants who've been there for decades, and not be bullied by that. And that, like, it sounds so silly, but that's staffing consideration, those appointment considerations, like it trickles down and it has an effect on how much you can get done.
Yeah, it's a whole separate. Yeah. Sorry, it's a whole separate topic. We have 40 years, right? So,
but and I want to give a little bit of time for some of these audience questions. So, and this one sort of piggybacks perfectly on that. Derek Norton asked, so once a leader becomes PM, he relies on the pool of talent in his caucus from which he has to choose his cabinet. How can a leader like Poilievre attract people to become MPs? I mean, I think this is a big part of it in my mind. And I've heard this firsthand from people who, would-be candidates in prior election cycles saying, hey, I just don't want to waste my time running under this leader. I'm curious if you think Pierre's leadership represents an opportunity for higher caliber candidates showing up ahead of the next general election, and whether that sort of directly influences the competence we get in cabinet, and if that trickles down to sort of our ability to get things done once we form government. Is that relationship as direct as I would hope it would be? Like if you've got some really, really strong would-be candidate who's been waiting in the wings for the right moment to run, is this the right moment for them to put their names forward and to run?
For sure. I mean, I think a leader with such a distinct policy, like, go back to the very first question, like that offers us a distinct choice for Canadians, is going to finally have people that say, hey, I want to be part of something that gets something done. I'd like to actually run for this guy or with this guy, is going to naturally attract, I'll say more, I don't want to say higher caliber. I think there's some great members of caucus right now. So I'll just say more and different people. And we're now drawing from a party that's 600,000 or 700,000 members large, as opposed to usually you do draw from outside the party for candidates, but a lot of time you're drawing from inside the party. So he's already drawn in, 312,000 members or whatever, and other candidates brought in people that I'm sure are good. So typically if your party's bigger, you're going to have more people sort of understanding where it is the candidates come from and thinking about running. So I think he will attract candidates. And the other thing is, 10 years into a government, the Trudeau government, people are going to realize like this is we're hopefully going to be going into a change election. So that should be exciting and draw some people to the table.
Yeah. The thing about having a strong vision is like, what do we mean by good candidates? Sometimes you go after, especially if you are a visionless leader, your goal is like to have star candidates. Well, Bill Morneau is a star candidate, but like, was he a successful politician or a strong cabinet minister? I mean, like I don't think so. I don't even the Liberals in retrospect would think so. And so, like, I think Poilievre's approach to candidate recruitment will be like, if you're excited by my vision and you're scrappy and you want to get things done, like, I don't really care what your resume says all that much, unless it's just evidence that you're scrappy and you get things done. But like, there's this whole elite working class thing. Like, I hope we have a lot of candidates who run for us as conservatives who come from working class experiences and who therefore are a little bit pissed off and do want to get things done. And I think he will attract those kind of candidates. And I think those will be better candidates than what you might traditionally think of as like star candidates, because they have an elite resume pedigree that ultimately makes them A, not cut out for politics, and B, not necessarily on board with a vision that's going to make change.
Yeah, I'll say, and then I'm mindful of time, we have 4 minutes, but I'll say one thing that I've seen in the US that sounds like a really good idea is this. I don't know if it's a PAC or some other not-for-profit structure, but it's called American Moment. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it basically stems from a recognition that political staff have outsized influence, because as government gets larger and more complex, a lot of these things get delegated, and then kind of nameless, faceless political staff who might be, to your point, Michael, like 22 years old, actually like impact the outcome of whatever the file is and like shape the future of the country. So American Moment actively seeks to identify and recruit strong, ideologically aligned staffers to kind of place them and basically have like a bench team ready to go. So maybe that's like a concluding comment for you, Jamil, something that you could work on or that you are working on with CSFN. But any kind of final thoughts on that or in general for the audience, and then we'll do a quick wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm not familiar with American Moment. We don't have that in Canada, and I was involved in staffing up at the start of the Ford government, and maybe even seen this from the outcomes of much of the Ford government. Like, there's not a lot of strong staffers in that government with an ideological bent as to what the outcome should be. So anything we can do, or anything you can do to improve that bench strength would be amazing.
This is probably a good opportunity for Jamil to plug.
Yeah, I'll take that as a segue. So we actually launched a couple months ago in August a new program called Conservative Values Tomorrow, where we had over 80 applicants of conservatives under the age of 30, many of whom are interested in being staffers, and we weren't able to admit all of them into the program, unfortunately, because of resource limitations, which is a plug, by the way, for fundraising if you'd like to support our efforts. But we do have 17 of them going through a 6-month mentorship program where they've got mentors with experience in the movement and also participate in a series of workshops on a number of different issues related to staffing, policymaking, strategic advice, media relations. So we are doing exactly in the Canadian context what I think Chris described well that American Moment is doing in the American context. The biggest difference, and I'm going to stress this a second time just to get the point across, is that we don't have enough people investing in this work outside of the partisan political party structure. So if you believe this work is important, feel free to support us, whether that's through a donation, which you can find at CanadaStrongandFree.network, our donation page, or even just letting us know where you think we might be able to expand our efforts and get more support. Because I will say there is a demand among millennial and Gen Z or conservatives for more community, more training, more mentorship, more opportunity. I think honestly, it sort of falls on everybody else to actually meet the demand. And right now we're not doing that as a movement. So I think there's a tremendous amount of work to be done to make sure that every young person who wants to learn what it means to be a conservative and develop the skills and experiences necessary to make a difference in the world of politics actually has a clear pathway on how to do that. One of the things you'll see, another plug I'll put in for our conference in March, which is on March 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, is that this cohort of youth leaders that we've been working with since August will all be featured as speakers at the conference. They will be on stage, they will be panelists, they will be moderators. Our goal is to put young conservatives in a position to see themselves as equals, and that their age is not seen as a reason why they can't participate equally with everyone else. So I think that this is part of the generational transformation that we're working on at the Canada Strong and Free Network. And I will say, just going back to the theme of today's conversation, the success of Pierre Poilievre has absolutely 100% benefited every conservative organization in terms of being able to reach young people. As mentioned throughout this conversation, the social media presence of the Poilievre leadership campaign, his ability to deliver messages and talking points that resonate with young people across the country on things like affordability, for example, in the housing crisis, and also his savviness. I mean, he's comfortable on the platforms where a lot of, if not most, millennials and Gen Zers are getting their political news and their information. So I think that in terms of trying to achieve this sort of generational shift where we've got a lot of young people ready to staff a government and hit the ground running, to me, in the work I do, I've observed the impact that the Poilievre campaign has already had on that. And I think that's only going to get bigger with more time. And that would be one of the reasons why I consider myself a Canadian optimist. Boom. Matt, Chris, anything else we should add before we wrap up?
I think you did a great job.
Okay.
Yeah, and thank you once again to Ginny and Michael for joining. I think that was a great conversation.
Yeah, I mean, Ginny and Michael are two of my favorite people to hear from on politics, and it was great to welcome you both to this discussion series. Look forward to having you again at another one of our future events. Thanks to everybody who tuned in. Regardless of where you find yourself in this fine country, we really appreciate you being part of these conversations. Again, save the date for March 22nd, 23rd, and 24th in Ottawa for our next national conference, and we look forward to chatting with you again soon. Take care, everybody.